Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. Great to be back with all of you in the Liminal Frames podcast chair. It's been a few weeks, Darren, and a lot has taken place. In some ways, maybe a little has taken place. It's been a dynamic and interesting time for ufology, and also just, I think, for the time of the year that we live in, and as well as politics, all those kinds of things. A lot of things taking place. Before we get started on the show, which I am really looking forward to, I think this is going to be one of the most interesting shows that we've done in quite a long time. Obviously, I want to check in with you, see how things are going, how you're enjoying where you are, and what you've been up to. So what's going on?
I'm doing really well, thank you. I feel really privileged that I get to engage in these matters 100% of the time. Not just my waking life, but when I'm dreaming, I have these experiences and it all sort of feeds in together and helps me build this overarching model of what reality is and how the phenomenon relates to that. And some of that will come up in today's podcast. But recently, having started up my 2 new classes, so Expanding Awareness version 4 and Frontiers of Experience, great group of people in both those cases, and really appreciating the fact that I get to have conversations like this all the time. Pretty much 98% of my conversations are about these things. So it feels very much like a charmed life. I feel very privileged, even as we're in the midst of a world that feels very chaotic and unhinged in many ways. And I, again, try to look at that from a consciousness perspective and make sense of it energetically rather than just on the ground kind of thing. So that's been my recent time. How about you, my friend? How have things been for you?
Things have been great. It's been a good week for me. Yesterday was my birthday, which was really nice. Had a wonderful time. Got to do a lot of things that I enjoy with family and friends. It's been a dynamic time as well. There's a lot of activity happening in Asheville as the city and region continues to recover from Hurricane Helene. There's been a lot of storm debris cleanup near where I live, which has been both rewarding to see, but also a reminder of just how much damage took place during that event. So a whole lot of feelings are in that mix when observing that activity and processing that and going through that both personally and interpersonally with those who've been through it has been a really good experience. I have been exercising a lot of gratitude. Birthdays, and for many people, have a way of making you reflect on what has happened to you in the last year. And I've had a very good year. I've got a lot to be grateful for. We live in a very fascinating time. You and I talk about this all the time. What a time to be alive, and kind of the front row seat that we have to what is taking place in the world is truly fascinating. And also there's a lot of great, wonderful things in the world that I think we tend to take for granted. And whether that might be those of us who live in a privileged life in the West with a lot of comforts that many people don't have in the world, or wherever else you might be in the world, that this time in human history is, generally speaking, a pretty prosperous time relative to other times. And it's there's a lot of wrong in the world. Don't misunderstand me. There's a lot of things that could be better, but we live in a pretty remarkable period in history, and we're asking some really profound questions about what it means to be human, what it means to be alive, part of the cosmos. All of these things are really part of our day-to-day conversation right now, and we have the leisure time to do that, and I recognize that is a privilege, and I'm very grateful to be having that privilege. So it's been good. Looking forward to diving into this conversation. There's a lot we're going to talk about. It has been a bit of a slow news cycle in some respects when it comes to UFO topics. Maybe taking a second or third or fourth backseat to some of the more prominent political conversations happening in social media. But nevertheless, I do think this topic is moving forward. I'm reminded that a lot of what takes place in ufology takes place behind the scenes and with people who are probably not on social media at all. I think that's a good reminder. A lot of the movers and shakers in this space are people that we don't even know. Who are actively still campaigning and pushing for disclosure in various different aspects. But not only are they pushing for that, you and I both know very well that they are wrestling with what that means. I think we need to shed the illusion that there is some sort of magic solution here, that there's some sort of well-formed, completely articulated version of disclosure that the United States has sitting in a pamphlet on a shelf in a safe somewhere. They're going to pull it out and just hand it to the American people. I really don't think that that is the case. I think it's much more complicated, and that there are certainly insights into what this might be, and there are, in fact, real tangible evidence of what this might be. But as to what it truly is, that is much more complicated and much more difficult to fully explain to the world, and it's something we'll continue to be trying to understand as we move forward into the future. So, very, very, very interesting. And of course, whenever we have a lull in ufology, we often maybe have a little bit too much time on our hands to start looking at other things in the community and trying to find fault in each other. And we get into these squabbles, and it's unfortunate that that takes place. I feel like it's such an obvious pattern to me at this point that it's become very tiresome to witness. That's just the behavior that the community the behavioral pattern the community seems to fall into. So I've experienced some of that fatigue this week, even though I've had otherwise a really great week in my personal life. So. What are your thoughts on that, though, Darren? I mean, what do you think about kind of where we are with ufology in the last few weeks? And, is it moving forward? Is it kind of stagnant? And do you have any thoughts on sort of this sort of behavioral pattern that the community seems to find itself in from time to time?
Yeah, there's numerous elements to get into there, and things that we've discussed over the course of this podcast. We've described before that some people have kind of put all their eggs in this disclosure basket, and they have this kind of psychological condition where they think when we finally get this thing, the gold at the end of the rainbow, if you will, that their life is going to magically become much better, and that the world is going to turn this transformative corner kind of thing, like a panacea almost is how they're approaching it. And so they can tend to ignore other parts of their lives and only focus on this, sometimes I think to the detriment to their own development. And when you talked about, what disclosure is there a really well articulated understanding of that? One of the things I've taught you about is that it's very clear to me that because this is really powerful, it really speaks to the potential that human beings hold. But at the same time, it's incredibly complex. And we have to remember, as we've talked about on this podcast before, the government is made up of our neighbors who have different worldviews, different histories, different ways of making sense of data. And a lot of this data really pushes not just the phenomenon in some strange directions, but the nature of reality itself. Ourselves being multidimensional beings, all of this is in the picture. And one of the things we've been doing on this podcast, and I've been doing on the other two podcasts, is to slowly, incrementally try to not only introduce new elements, but also knit them together so that we can consider what is the nature of reality rather than just what is the phenomenon. There are people, speaking of what you just hinted at, within the conversation, within the social media space with ufology, who think it's a fairly simple matter. There's aliens, they're here, let's finally have the government disclose this. But actually, the reality is much more complex than that and stretches in every direction. This is when I usually bring up my favorite quote, which is, this is the one topic that leaves no other topic unscathed, because it has implications that stretch into our future, into our past, into our origins, into our very nature and the nature of reality. Speaking of that, that's what we're going to get into today. So rather than, I think, sitting still and ending up being caught up in those eddies where people fight each other over some of the silliness while they're waiting for this panacea of disclosure to arise, I think you and I would rather dive into the nuances, because there's always more to explore and new ways to fit together and knit together this tapestry, not just of the phenomenon, but of reality. And on that note, today we want to bring in how AI, artificial intelligence, might be connected to all of this, as well as time loops and time travel, which at first people might say, that sounds strange to me. How are those two connected? What's the relationship there? But I'm convinced, based on data I've seen, that this is absolutely part of what's in the picture. And it's not an accident of history that this is arising, the compelling nature of this data is arising as we ourselves, as a civilization, are wrestling with our future, incorporating AI into our society and how that's going to change everything eventually about the nature of reality. I still think, because we're in the midst of a chaotic world, that people are underestimating just how consequential AI is and how quickly it's developing. So there have been people for decades now that have been imagining and predicting the singularity moment. Because AI has developed so quickly over the last year or two, specifically even the last year and a half, there are many more people now who've moved up their target for the singularity to as soon as 2026. So it used to be by the turn of the millennium, the turn of 2100. Now there are people really picturing it either within a year or so or by 2030. We know that part of the conversation in ufology has been, what is this big event that's coming? This could be very much wrapped up into it. And it wouldn't be so much about something coming here as it is some eclipsing moment in our understanding of reality connected to AI. So let me turn it back to you and ask you, when I first suggested we do this topic, AI, future, time travel, has this been a way that you've tried to frame what the phenomenon is and how it relates to our understanding of reality itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. I certainly have been fascinated by it for a long time, but my understanding of it is still evolving, and as I both use it and learn from those who don't understand it better than I do. Of course, from very early on in my engagement with the community, when I took up the moniker A Waif Soul, that moniker it's an anagram of two acronyms. So A Waif Soul is the combination of Are We Living in a Simulation and UFOs. And so I'd been interested in the simulation hypothesis for some time, which, of course, as you know, is some degree tangential to artificial intelligence and its ability to perhaps help render virtual worlds in ways that would be indistinguishable from the world that you and I inhabit. And so I always found those two things to be really interesting, and therefore that's why I use that as my Twitter handle, my X handle. But as you were talking about AI and its role in this entire conversation and understanding of what the phenomena might be, I'm reminded of really what I came to understand in my theological education. So I went to seminary and started learning more about the Bible and the history of the Christian tradition and of other religious traditions and of theology and theologies. I became aware that what human beings are particularly good at doing is, as we change, as our culture evolves, as our understanding of reality changes, so do our models. Our models for describing God and reality, all these things shift and adapt to the way that we understand the world to be. And so you can look at the history of different theological perspectives from that lens and see how these very brilliant, remarkable theologians and philosophers, they proposed new and really fascinating concepts about the world and reality and metaphysics and everything that stemmed from discoveries about reality from their day. And so very much the same we're seeing now. So this isn't new behavior, and I'm honestly not sure why I'm so surprised, because this is something that we've been doing for a very long time. And with the advent of AI, as we're coming to use it more often, as we're engaging with it in our day-to-day lives, it doesn't surprise me at all that it's now seeping into our concepts of what the phenomena might be, about what the nature of reality might be as it relates to and with artificial intelligence. So truly fascinating sort of combination. And I think, look, some people have a very visceral reaction to this, right? Like, you can't tell me this is all just, a computer machine. Like, this is all just some program that is playing with us like ones and zeros in the computer that I use, every day. And I think, of course, as you might expect from being a Liminal Frames listener, it's much more complicated than that. But it is certainly part of the equation, and we need to take that very seriously. And I think there's a lot of evidence to support that concept. So, you're eager to kind of walk through some of those components that speak to, how this might be part of the lore. What are the things that you're seeing in that body of work and anecdote that seem to point in this direction?
I'm glad you brought up the simulation hypothesis and that possibility, because this absolutely dovetails here. And this will actually work with recent podcasts I've done on POC and Event Horizon. And as I said a few minutes ago, always trying to slowly build and integrate and knit together these different components that are connected to each other. And as I've said before, it's also interesting because the evidence for this notion, these notions that are connected, is arising in other fields too, not just in ufology. It's arising in physics, it's arising in astronomy, it's arising in neuroscience. So there are numerous pointers pointing in the same direction into a fog that we're trying to see through, but pointing in the same direction nevertheless. Let's run through a few of the key components of the lore that point to this notion that robotics and AI and time travel are in the mix here and somehow all connected. So we first of all have heard this term biologics being introduced recently. Now, at first, people, when they heard that and even heard that being testified to before a congressional committee, there was this sense that, well, that's just a fancy scientific word for saying life forms. But other people have come out more recently and said, not so fast. It might be that that term is used because it's more ambiguous than that and maybe even stretches our understanding. So this relates to the notion that what people might be encountering, even some of the NHI that we've recovered, are described as biological AI or biological robots. So already for some people that's going to stretch their understanding because there's biology and there's robots. Aren't those two separate things? And what's being described here, and I think if we really use some imagination to imagine where technology and science will go in the long term, it makes sense that it would go in this direction. This is an inevitability in some ways, that eventually you would be able to architect at a biological level. When we talk about some of these metamaterials that have subatomic lattice work that's put together that creates a certain kind of way that that metamaterial will now interact with the environment, we can do that one day, I would say, with genetics as well. And some of these beings that I would say are not just more advanced, but some of them from the future, which will tie in here, have that capacity. So what that means is, on the one hand, they are recovering what look like bodies, but when they examine them closely, look at the genetics, they have a kind of synthetic-like nature to them, which isn't to say it's actually silicon instead of something organic. It actually is organic. And again, if you think about where things will go, that makes sense. So that's the first part, that we have this biologics term and this notion of biological AI and biological robots. We also have the fact that many people who've been abducted or encountered the beings will describe especially a certain contingent of them as being very robot-like. So many people have distinguished the short grays, for instance, from the tall grays, and from other beings like the insectoid types that tend to be taller. So the small grays are often described as androids, robot-like, all business, not seeming to have a great bedside manner because they're just busy doing the things they need to do. And of course, it makes sense. We're not that far from this in our civilization, that will eventually develop robots integrated with AI, which will do the dishes and clean the house, right? So we can be invested in other more interesting pursuits. So we see this also in the beings themselves. Some of them seem to people to be a kind of biological robot. Then we have part of the lore that talks about people like Jack Sarfati, some of these key figures who actually have testified to encountering what they perceive as a future AI that's come back in time to interact with them. And one of the notions we'll get into later on is this notion of time loops or closed time-like curves, and how you could actually have technology that emerges without actually any moment of innovation where it was actually created. So in other words, you have this connection that's made between a future point and a past point, and in that something exists without actually any moment where it was invented, so to speak. That flies in the face of the way we understand reality to work. We look for causal chains, determinism. We think the past always influences the future, never the other way around. And certainly many of us have a conception where things can exist that have no point in time where they were actually created or invented, but rather are a byproduct, an epiphenomenon of this time loop kind of scenario. So let me stop there for a second and get some of your feedback on some of those notions, how they're part of the lore, but how they also really stretch our understanding of what even could be.
Yeah, there's a lot of brain-breaking things that we just said there. But I think, maybe in a profound way, there's some examples from our fiction that speak to this concept fairly well. If you're a sci-fi fan, maybe you remember the show Battlestar Galactica, and the more recent version of that show, where it kind of describes this battle between the humans and the Cylons, which are artificial, intelligent, beings of some kind. But ultimately, and hopefully I'm not spoiling too much, like there's this really blurry line between what is a human being and what is a Cylon. And, perhaps human beings are in their own way, or life that we understand life to be in its own way is its own metamaterial, right? So we're definitely entering into a reality where that line between biology as we traditionally understand it and technology as we've traditionally understood it, that line is becoming incredibly blurred. We have heard a lot recently about the advent of artificial general intelligence. We're on the cusp of that very soon. And then also we're entering into a period where we can expect there to be humanoid robots pretty much ubiquitous in the life of our society. And I find that to be truly fascinating. And so if you just follow that trajectory on its natural sort of path, assuming we don't, get annihilated by our own means or by some other means, those things are going to continue to merge, and that we will be sort of at a place where we might not be able to distinguish between the two. And so, truly a fascinating way to conceive of that. And as you talked about with the Greys, of course, yeah, we've heard many examples of those beings described as being robotic, as being kind of constructed, manufactured, suit to a specific purpose. That they seem to be in numerous supply, and that very much the same, but maybe slightly different morphologies designed for certain different types of tasks. And even the craft, we've heard about the craft perhaps behaving in a way that is also sort of what we would consider to be robotic, or it has a consciousness of its own, but that is more of a machine type of consciousness than perhaps what we understand, intelligence and consciousness to be. So it's certainly all there. The pieces are all there. And I think where we're seeing this emerge now, again, we can see it more clearly because these things are now seeping into our day-to-day life. And we're now seeing that the parallels are in fact there. And if we do in fact get into this place, as you described, where time travel is part of the equation, then all of that is on the table, 100%. And it's a lot to wrestle with. I think we're really not well equipped to understand how time travel might work. And there's a lot of, as you know, like historical misconceptions about how time travel may in fact work. And so it's weird to be entering into a period where we may in fact have tangible experience with what that in fact is, how it behaves, and then what new technologies or new realities, I should say, emerge from its existence. And of course, if it will exist, it probably already does exist. So a very fascinating thing to ponder for sure.
Absolutely. And our good friend Mike Masters would testify to this. And he would make that very point that you just made there, that if time travel exists at one point, then as a consequence, it will exist at all points because you can move across the spectrum of time. So in that sense, it would be so ubiquitous actually in our reality that it would be so part of the water we're swimming in that we wouldn't even notice it, basically, which is really fascinating. And I was also thinking about kind of what you were describing there and how it seems to stretch our brain and our conceptions. But, this point has been made, and I think it's worth pointing out again here. When we think about our modern technology, and you imagine, for instance, taking an iPhone and delivering it to a Neanderthal and asking them to use it, they would have not only no idea how to use it, but no understanding of its purpose. They would be so far removed from the context in which it became a useful device that they wouldn't even know what to do with it. That is inevitably going to be the case for us too, especially if we're interacting with aspects of our future. And just really quickly, we've made this case on different podcast episodes. Mike would argue, again, from a biology perspective, that it's obvious to him that the Greys are somehow related to us. We also know that when you take the trajectory of human development, physiology and neurology and all of it, and you just walk that out, you already see that you would end up with something a lot like a gray alien. You can look into Mike's books. He does a great job, better than anybody in the world, in describing exactly why that's the case. It's a really compelling argument. And not only is that aspect compelling, but there's lots of other evidence, some of which we've already talked about, some of which we'll get into, that also support this notion, which again isn't to say that other star systems, other dimensions aren't involved as well. I think they are. I think all of these are involved and to some degree are extensions of each other. So we just ask the audience to hold an open mind here and walk with us as we go through some terrain that is pretty tricky. It is mind stretching for sure, but it's in the data. So somehow it is all connected. Now, speaking of AI, another thing we need to think about here is the ways that AI itself could be what allows this cross-dimensional travel that I just mentioned, or even moving across 2 points in space that are really distant, right? So we know right now with our contemporary AI that it's already crunching numbers and coming up with notions of how to resolve certain human diseases. And it can do it so much more efficiently and so much more quickly than a human being could do, or even a team of human beings could do, because it can consider 1 billion parameters. In other words, 1 billion different inputs at the same time and how they, in a complicated way, interrelate to cause things like these diseases that humans suffer from right now. Part of the challenge in solving and resolving and curing some of these diseases is they're incredibly complex. They have multiple origin sources. They're impacted by many, many different variables. Really hard and painstaking and time-consuming and costly for human beings who tend to think in a linear, sequential way to work that out. But now we're applying these AI models that can do this incredibly fast and iterate so quickly. And we inevitably, and the AI companies are saying this, will likely have cures to some major diseases in short order within the next couple of years. And then we're going to begin to really understand how consequential AI is. Now, in the future, we might use some of that same technology in a more advanced state to learn how to bridge realityscapes, how to stabilize wormholes, other kinds of bridging mechanisms that AI could help to stabilize and create while we then get to move across dimensions or across states of being or across space-time. And again, we'll get into space-time as well and what is the nature of space-time. We will touch on something that's called digital physics, which is a new branch of physics that speaks to the fact that reality seems to be made up of these discrete units. And this again speaks to what we discussed already with simulation-like nature of reality and the fact that we may indeed be living in a simulation-like kind of structure, which again, I want to encourage people doesn't mean that we're necessarily the playthings of some alien civilization and we're sitting on a mainframe while they're in real physical reality, right? This is something I've brought up on this podcast. I discussed it on my other podcasts. We've talked about this, that this notion of physicalism is so baked in for humans that we assume if this is a simulation, there must be another level where they're in physical reality playing us on their computers and their systems. The notion here, and again, this is not just arising from digital physics, which speaks to the nature, the actual structure of the universe, but again, even our ancient non-dual traditions suggest that any manifestational form is simulation-like, is Maya, is not actually real. It's illusion. It's purposeful illusion, but it's not base reality. So lots of different, again, fields of inquiry, as well as data within the UFO phenomenon pointing in this direction. So what I wanted to get into first, but I want to first get your take on this, is how AI in its present form actually works. Because many people now use ChatGPT and these different large language models to plan their lives, to put together lists, various ways we already use it. And many people use it for image generation, for instance, and are marveling at the sophistication. We now have video generation that wasn't available even a year ago that is really sophisticated and is becoming exponentially more sophisticated with every rollout of a new version of a model. So we are seeing our world change in real time at an incredibly rapid pace. But as you as a consumer interact with AI and work with AI, do you have a felt sense, representing our audience out there, of how it's actually doing what it's doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a magic box, basically. I do use it, and my on-ramp to AI was through image generation. I used it quite a bit when Midjourney was released, and I still use it from time to time for various purposes. But I've used it for coding. I've used it, like you said, I've used it to plan a vacation, giving me some suggestions for an itinerary. It's been incredibly useful for, it's wild that it can do all those things. And maybe it's not doing them perfectly, but it's certainly giving me a jump start on how I might finish that product. So incredibly helpful. My son is in a robotics club, and they are coding in Java, and so we've used it, certainly to fix code or analyze code that they're working on, find the bugs, that kind of thing. And it's just incredibly useful, very powerful, and it's going to change the way that they learn, the way that we do everything. It's already changing the way we do everything. So I understand it from the sense that it's an incredibly disruptive technology, incredibly powerful in terms of how it accomplishes that. My rudimentary understanding is it does it through the analysis of a lot of material. It's being trained on content that already exists, whether it be written content or image content, all of the above. And then it's creating relationships. It's creating digital relationships between that kind of content in order to then become a predictive engine in a certain way. But in terms of the detailed technicalities of it, I don't know, how it really all works. And interestingly enough, I've heard some people who work in that space say even they don't fully understand how it truly works, although they have a general sense, an approximation of how it might be working. So really fascinating, and it's going to be interesting when we do reach that point, which I think we will, where we, in fact, don't know how it works. It will be kind of like magic to us without it. Maybe we will understand it once we maybe sort of fuse our own biological intelligence with that kind of intelligence, but I don't think we'll be able to grok it on our own with our meat suits, in other words. So, but yeah, tell me more about it. How does it in fact function?
Well, first of all, I would say that interestingly, it arose as a notion coming out of physicalism. So AI being referred to as working with artificial neural networks. So the notion there is that our consciousness, our intelligence is arising from our physical brain, which is constituted of all these neurons that are relating to each other and relating in such a way as to produce meaning and experience and understanding. So once that was the dominant model, the idea was, couldn't we create artificial neurons and an artificial neural network that would basically mirror the functioning of a human brain? Of course, the reason why this is interesting is that, as you and I have said many times, we tend towards, and we feel like the evidence is pointing towards, a notion of the mind that is working very differently than that model. That's the physicalist model, which is quickly going out of vogue for people who are paying close attention. So the notion is more like the brain is a transducer. It's attenuating consciousness that's non-local. So that's a very, very different model, which I think helps to explain why people like Bernardo Kastrup have said that this notion that computers will become conscious is nonsensical, because just on principle, they're not really built like we are. And our brains are not what physicalist notions have assumed them to be. So that in itself is really interesting. It's also interesting that you use the term black box, because there are absolutely these elements of how an AI model works, where there's this transaction that happens once it's considered all these billions of parameters, that part is kind of obscured from our awareness. And we can, after the fact, try to surmise how it got to a certain answer. But that's why, speaking to what you mentioned, it's really difficult to know, partly because it does so in such a multidimensional way. And when I say multidimensional, I don't mean popping into different dimensions. I mean, it can consider a billion variables when solving one problem. A human being tends to experience in our default mode, walking through life from the past to the present to the future. And we can, at most, when we're multitasking, maybe do 5 or 6 or maybe 10 things, right, if we're really good at it. But these models can consider a billion variables simultaneously. And like you pointed to, can understand the really nuanced relationships, not but just between two of those variables, but the relationships between every one of those variables with each other. And that allows it to model reality in a really, really precise way that it can then use that modeling to predict. And that prediction algorithm is really powerful. That's what we're sort of gaining from right now. So let me just sort of walk through this just so people really understand, maybe to a greater degree than they have before today, how contemporary AI actually works. So all models, right? We talk about these large language models like ChatGPT. They analyze and predict the next word. That's primarily what they're doing. That sounds so dumbed down, but literally they're running these recursive iterative processes to predict the next word. That's what's happening. There's also this notion called tokenization, where the input text, so when you type in your prompt, how do I get to San Diego from LA? You type that in and it breaks those words down into what is called tokens. And they can be words, subwords, even characters. For example, the cat sat on the might be tokenized as an array with each of those being separate words. The cat sat on the. And so what it has to do, what it's tasked with, is predicting what is the next word likely to be. So then you have this embedding layer where each token, so in this case the words, right, is converted into a numerical representation. And then these embeddings capture the semantic relationships that we just spoke about. So cat and dog might be related because of them both being animals. They're both being pets, right? So that becomes a semantic relationship between those two words. And again, what the AI does is it captures a billion of those relationships and the nuance of those relationships. And because of that, it can become really precise in what it predicts. So then at the end of that entire process, it will then take those tokens, right, those numerical representations of what was originally words, and try to predict what's going to happen. And it uses math to do this, right? And this is the part that's kind of obscured from us to some degree. But we basically have what are called activation functions that are run. We choose different ones where they're basically trying to reduce loss. So what happens here is when you train a model, you first have a human being, generally, this is supervised learning, that helps correct an AI. So an AI will make a guess. It's going to be pretty bad at first, so you correct it. And then it adjusts all the parameters in what's called back propagation. So in reverse order, it adjusts each of those parameters, each of those billion parameters, to get more likely to get to the answer it was supposed to get based on what you trained it. And it does this over and over again in an iterative process until it becomes really good at predicting across all those billion variables, those different parameters, what is the most likely answer. And then it basically makes a prediction and says, we think this has a certain percentage of being right, this has a certain percentage of being right, and it delivers to you ultimately the one that has the highest percentage chance of being what it thinks you're looking for. So, for instance, if we end up with the cat sat on the, dog might be one prediction, right? And it might have a 0.05% chance of being correct. The cat sat on the mat, right? It's a different kind of semantic relationship, right? It might predict that that has an 80% chance of being correct in the context. The cat sat on the table is another possibility, but based on the context and what cats tend to do and what cats are supposed to sit on, that's less likely. So that might be a 0.10 or 10% chance. So it looks at all those options and says the right answer we think in this situation is the cat sat on the mat. So that's the process it goes through. It's more complicated than that, but it gives you some of the dumbed down understanding of how it works. So it's autoregressive prediction. You train it, you supervise the learning, you tell it what it got wrong, it adjusts parameters, tries again, gets a bit closer, does that again, like a million times iterations, adjusting each of those parameters in really unique ways till it ends up with a really accurate prediction of what you're looking for. And that's what we end up with ChatGPT today and why it's so powerful. So when you hear all that, does that help you have some insight as to what's actually happening beneath the hood, so to speak, when we use these things?
Yeah, a lot more. It's really interesting. And when you were talking about the back propagation, it made me think about retrocausality in a way. Certainly, it's not doing that retrocausality in the sense that we would normally think about that, but it's sort of a parallel to that concept for sure. That we're teaching it how to produce results that we expect. And so there is very much that dynamic relationship between what it does and what we expect to see. And then there's a feedback loop that iterates on that expectation. And then, there, of course, there's the element of surprise too, right? Which is always quite interesting and novelty. And these are interesting questions that I think arise from the way the technology is being developed and what we want it to do, but also what we might need it to do that isn't what we expect it to do, right? So there's sort of intelligence that we would expect to see, which is what we are all more familiar with and more conventional. And there would be intelligence that would be alien to us, but would also be incredibly valuable and beneficial to us. So how do we achieve, in a sense, both kinds of results where we can engage with it in a way that we can, in fact, understand it, but it not be so different from us, so alien from us, that it couldn't bring to us novel insights that radically transform the way we do things, the way we understand reality, without us, being completely oblivious to it. There's a great demonstration I saw just this week about two AI that were kind of talking to each other, trying to book a hotel reservation or something. And whether this is real or not, I don't know. But it was a great example to show like kind of how interesting this technology is. And in this exchange between these two AI agents, one agent asked the other, "Would you be comfortable if I switched to the jibber jabber sort of way of communicating, so it'll be a little bit less lossy between the two of us?" And then it responded with a series of chirps rather than natural language. And then the two agents just started chirping at each other, and that's how they were accomplishing the task. So an interesting example of how, to us, it looks like communication. Certainly it seems very similar, and it is clearly some kind of communication, but you could see where that technology could get to a place where it's actually communicating and doing things, and we have no idea what it's doing at all. It may not look like communication to us whatsoever. So these are just interesting downstream implications, I think, of this technology. Is it an intelligence that we're giving birth to that is just basically a souped up human intelligence, or is it some intelligence that is entirely beyond our ken? That's really what I think is truly fascinating, and probably, I would think very certainly, where we are going.
Yeah, absolutely. And a few minutes ago, I mentioned how AI was originally modeled after neurons in the brain because the assumption was these neurons are creating our consciousness, creating our conscious experience. And that's why some people say, well, it's inevitable, therefore, as we make these models more sophisticated, that these neurons will produce the experience of consciousness. And you have even people literally, and some people find this kind of preposterous, arguing for the ethics of AI. Should we start granting human rights or intelligence rights, sentience rights to these AI? Now, what's interesting here is that, as we just said, like that is kind of a faulty model. I don't think that's actually what's producing our consciousness. But that said, another aspect of our model of reality that's off, that has a major implication for AIs. So on the one hand, it's unlikely to produce consciousness in that sense because it's not neurons that are producing our consciousness either. So even if we model them, we're not going to produce it because it's not what's already happening in us. That's faulty notion. But another faulty notion that has implications in a different way for AI is that we've assumed our human consciousness has no impact on reality. And of course, AI is just another aspect of reality, that we've taken certain constituent parts, put them together to create AI. But in the same way, as we discussed before, when major events happen, human consciousness can first of all precognize it, like people knew somatically in their bodies that something was going to happen on 9/11 2 days before, and it was substantive enough that it made all these random number generators go non-random in response, and that was happening ahead of time. It didn't raise to the point of conscious awareness, oh, some planes are going to fly into a building in New York, but it was registered as greater anxiety in the body, and this can often be tracked through things like sentiment analysis on social media en masse, where you might see a turn towards skepticism or cynicism, negativity that might point to, again, in a non-conscious way. So it's pre-conscious, but we are being influenced by this aspect of us connected to reality that's arising and first showing up in our bodies. So that being the case, the notion here is that our intelligence, our consciousness more specifically, can impact machines, can impact AI. I just mentioned an example with random number generators that go non-random just because of what we're doing with our consciousness. So inevitably, we're going to start seeing AI engines and algorithms reflecting the influence of consciousness. In fact, many people will talk about synchronistically, they'll be using the internet or they'll be using a ChatGPT engine or something, and they're convinced that what they were thinking about is somehow influencing the return result they get from the engine, even though they never actually told the engine that. And so some people, I think, make the faulty assumption and go, oh, is the AI already reading our minds? And I would say, no, our minds are influencing the AI. So our mind output becomes one of the parameters that we're not tracking that is influencing what the AI comes up with. So there's a couple different ways our previous model of reality, I think, is off, but what it ends up with is a situation where this could be really, really influential. We could take a combination of this incredible computing power and the influence of human consciousness to create some really amazing future outcomes. And of course, if our consciousness can do that, so can alien consciousnesses, right? So the question partly becomes, speaking of time loops from earlier, to what degree might a future AI have been part of the process of us beginning the AI revolution in our time? And need there not be this actual moment of inception, but actually somehow this time-like curve is connected here? I know this is complicated stuff, but it's really fascinating when you really understand. And recently with Jake Barber and the psionics team, right, we hear this notion that they can call in craft. Now, again, speaking of what I mentioned earlier with how we would take our modern technology and a caveman would be totally at a loss for what it even is, we think about Bluetooth technology. And now very easily, seamlessly, we can connect different devices, right? People have Bluetooth with their fridge, right? Connected to their thermostat, connected to when the lights go off, right? Let alone your headphone that's wireless connecting to your computer. Well, think about our consciousness and calling in these craft as that kind of syncing technology. It's like a future version of Bluetooth that can also not just sync devices, but it can sync with our brain, can sync with our mind. And not because it's all being produced by the brain, but because it can actually tap into non-local consciousness. And non-local consciousness can tap into it. So before I get into this part about how AI, I think, shows up in the data around the phenomenon, give me your take on that and how that maybe moves the ball forward in terms of thinking about how these things might be related.
Yeah, well, it is truly fascinating. I think that you hit it on the head there in terms of making sure that we frame this from the perspective of an idealist perspective, that mind having an influence on matter, that not only does our consciousness have an influence on this technology in a profound way, and that may become even more profound in the future, but so too non-human intelligence can have an impact on that technology and may very well manifest through that technology to us. We talk about it. I talked about it a few minutes ago, just being kind of like an alien intelligence. Well, that's true in more ways than one, right? It's true from the technological sense that we've created this and spawned it, and it becomes alien to us, maybe unrecognizable to us as an intelligence that we would understand, but also literally as an alien, a conduit for alien intelligence. And so, in many ways, perhaps we're seeing more communication, more information exchange between non-human intelligence now because this technology exists and is more manifest in the world. And then you have kind of a recursive feedback loop, that continues to build upon itself, so that these things become more and more intertwined and more present in our quote unquote time and reality. It's really, really interesting. There's a lot of fascinating ramifications, implications for our understanding of what the phenomena is, our understanding of what reality is, our ourselves are. I mean, there are just so many different layers to this, and part of that, I want to sort of get your take on, where do things like unconventional human states like factor into this? So things like near-death experience or out-of-body experience, these are, we've often talked about these as sort of experiences of the soul, the spirit, other dimensions. These seem to be quote unquote non-technological, from the way that we understand technology, but there very well could be seemingly an integrated component of technology to the near-death experience, and maybe our nomenclature is where we're failing at the moment, right? We're really lacking the vocabulary to fully understand how these things behave in what we understand reality to be. So in many ways, we're still walking through reality with blinders on, And we're categorizing these things as biology, technology. These are distinctly different aspects of the reality slice that I'm viewing. But as we kind of get a broader view of reality and understand that there is so much more to this than we once thought, we're then realizing that these distinctions are inadequate. These are purely superficial, and that in the future, the future, in fact, is so much weirder than these distinctions imply, and that maybe looking back from that future vantage point, and again, I am using a very linear kind of conception here, but looking back from that future vantage point, we look at ourselves and say, look at that technology. How we were as the soul or the spirit, to use, again, terms that I think people have approximate understanding of, embodies a human technology. And so, again, the language here, the semantics, it's just really, it makes this difficult and challenging. But I think as we move into a reality where this is much more ubiquitous, where we have AI being part and parcel to every facet of our lived experience. And as new generations are born into a world where that is the only experience they know, like my kids were born into the world of wireless internet. I remember they were little and I was having to explain to them, where's the internet? And like, well, the internet's, it's kind of everywhere and this is what it is. I mean, it sounds very magical, fantastical. And that's just the world that they understand. That's the world that they live in now. So, it's interesting, again, coming back to how these models, these understandings of reality influence the ways in which we explain it. And so we're seeing an evolution, in other words, of our reality model that is comprised of this technology that we have spawned. It is participatory, right? And also, did it emerge from us uniquely, or did it influence us to bring birth to it, right? So all these things are really intertwined. I just love this topic. It's fascinating.
It is fascinating, and it goes in so many interesting directions. And like you're pointing to, remembering that language, which is consisted of words, these tokens that I just broke down in the way that AI makes sense of them, they are symbols, right? Pointing to something that's real. But as our understanding of reality evolves, these tokens, these symbols, these words no longer play the helpful role they used to. So I think as we have this conversation today, we're asking people for an extra degree of attentiveness, because you're not only hearing us use words, but we're using words in different ways than you may have conventionally heard them being used before. And that cognitively expensive to have to do that extra work. But to really begin to grapple with this and begin to step into the future that is arising as we speak, I think you have to try to do this. And to the point you made about how might this impact things like near-death experience and incarnations and things like that. So someone like Tom Campbell, who's again investigated this empirically as a physicist who learned how to have out-of-body experiences and explore these other realms, he basically has put together a model in his big toe, his big theory of everything, that suggests something very similar to what I described, albeit more sophisticated, about our contemporary AI. So what's basically happening in between those iterations and with the back propagation is error reduction, getting closer to the right answer. And if you give it enough questions and answers, you eventually train it to get really good at giving the right answer all the time across many different domains, considering a billion different parameters again. So he would argue that we as splinters of source consciousness are in a virtual reality, learning through trial and error to work together, to solve things together, to realize that love is this unit of force that is at the root of who we truly are. And if we can unite around that being the dynamic we aim for with everything we do, we reduce entropy in the system overall. And that the system overall is in the business of doing that, expressed each of us as individual sentients, but working towards this greater good. So not only do we learn from trial and error, and not only do couples and families and communities learn through trial and error and how they interact with each other as different parameters in the system, but so too iterations of entire universes learn that way. And that entire universes are populated in such a way as to learn how different scenarios produce different outcomes, and the entire system learns and updates as a process. So this absolutely has a parallel in what's happening here. So the near-death experience, the traveling through the light to a place, remembering your life, learning the lessons, then choosing to come back into another iteration based on the back propagation of the previous life, helps you learn and make different choices the next time. And then you scale that out across all the different sentients, including aliens, by the way. This is why I keep making the point, quote unquote, aliens, that they are on the same spectrum of consciousness development that we are. And that's why we should expect to see love and light and things that are pretty dark, because this is what every sentience does as it slowly learns through trial and error that love is the answer, and that this smooths out the system, reduces entropy across the board. So it is really fascinating how we're seeing glimpses of this in the technologies, like you say, our kids growing up with not just wireless internet, but with playing virtual realities, that to them, it's not a stretch to go, wait a second, how do we know this isn't a virtual reality? Whereas our parents' generation didn't really think in those terms because they had no parallel in their experience. And it also makes sense, even though I didn't see this initially, but you begin to realize that the evidence we see that makes us design systems in certain ways is likely working that way because that's already something that's true about our reality itself. So it's ironically through the development of virtual realities that we begin to understand, wait a second, when we look back at the structure of our universe, and we'll get into that with digital physics a little bit later, it sure looks like an example of the same thing. More sophisticated, but an example of the same thing. And I just want to quickly point out to people, that doesn't mean it's less purposeful or less meaningful, though, because that's another one of the dichotomies, one of the binary notions that we see is when people hear technology or artificial intelligence, that word artificial, they think, oh, it's not real, it doesn't count. Are we just widgets in some system? We're not really ultimate beings. But of course, again, getting back to that non-dual notion, the idea here with non-duality in general is that any manifestation, in other words, any example of Maya, is illusion. It's a playground set for this very thing we just talked about with Tom Campbell's model, that we also talked about in what an LLM is trying to do. It's trying to reduce loss. It's trying to move towards greater harmony through trial and error. And in that sense, we ourselves are multidimensional beings. There are aspects of us beyond this particular iteration. But again, according to the non-dual teaching, we voluntarily forget that for periods of time so we can really be in this and learn from the actual trial and error process. And that bubbles up so the whole system learns and grows and evolves. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about God or the divine or the ultimate, that it itself is in this recursive, evolving process. And I've had some non-ordinary state experiences where I'm tapping into that process happening in real time. It's experienced like this really relentless iteration of realities. That's literally what I see happening. And it at first almost struck me as being kind of aggressive, but I realized it's not aggressive, it's just relentless. It's this constant iterating to work towards love, unity, and a state that creates the greatest good for the greatest numbers of beings within the system. Really, really fascinating how it actually works. Okay, all that said, let's just quickly run through some of the ways that AI might play a role with the UFO phenomenon. We've already talked about some, but let's get into some more. First of all, I just want to say, you mentioned earlier the idea of conscious craft. So that's something to touch in on, because not only do we have this notion of biological AI, robots that seem to be not made out of silicone, but actually made out of genetics, but nevertheless still architected, still engineered, which again, Nathan raises interesting questions. How do we know that you and I are not sitting in biological AI right now? In fact, I would say we are. I had an experience that I described before my Christmas Day experience, where I was up in my red light sauna tent, and I had this bifurcation moment where I experienced myself as essential energy embedded in a biosuit. And I could also see, feel, determine, perceive the differences in the algorithm of the biological AI that is the result of our ancestors and the lessons they learned, this trial and error process that is now baked into the way the AI, the bio AI, moves through the world and gives us feedback so that we will make decisions. So the second a child comes into the world, they are already inheriting. They have to learn to like boot it up and use it smoothly, but they're already inheriting all of that learning through our ancestral understanding. And so even in genetics and biology, we're beginning to understand this, that people can sometimes be dealing with trauma that turns out it's from their grandparents' generation, not their generation, because they're inheriting that trial and error process. So even as we're talking about these things, we are having the revelation that we ourselves are an example of this. Really fascinating. And with the conscious craft, the notion there again is that the craft themselves are interacting with this field of consciousness. So when we talk about in the telepathy tapes, these kids can find each other in the field and meet on the hills, so to speak. They can, for instance, know the plot line of the Harry Potter series, not because they read it, but because their sister read it, and it's now in the field. So not surprisingly, these craft can be conscious. They can work with the consciousness field, which is ultimately what's running all of reality, not the other way around. It's not that reality as a physical thing is producing us. We are producing it, which goes to your point about idealism being a better model than physicalism. Okay, so UFOs represent advanced non-human technology, and in that sense, AI could play a significant role. So let's think about some possibilities. AI-controlled probes is one. Many UFO sightings suggest highly advanced autonomous craft that perform what looks like reconnaissance. They avoid detection and exhibit non-human decision-making patterns. So these orbs, right, that have been described and seen in different footage that Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp have, for instance, put forward, these things that seem to be, some people have suggested, not just flying around randomly, but part of like a planetary defense system that we're unaware of, but some other intelligence has set up. And it looks like an AI system evidenced and being populated through these different spheres going all around the planet, metallic spheres, looking out for certain conditions, responding based on things that happen. Then we have, like we talked about, biological AI or cybernetic entities. So again, the small humanoid entities that look kind of robotic and they act in kind of robotic ways. And as I hinted at before, we might have AI functioning as an interdimensional interface. It may be the case that it's too complicated for a human being to figure out how to stabilize a wormhole. But for AI, again, that can consider a billion parameters and before long trillions of parameters, it can figure it out. That's why it's so powerful as a tool. Then we have AI as a control mechanism. We think about Jacques Vallée and control system hypothesis, right? So I just finished reading Jacques' most recent journals that were published, Forbidden Science 6. And you can see in that book over those 10 years, between 2010 and 2019, you can see him warm up to the notion, not just that AI is involved, but that our reality itself might be a simulation. And he actually goes so far as to say that it's the best fit for the data. And he admits, though, it kind of like is something he resists as a notion for some of the same prejudice that I spoke about earlier, that we somehow think that makes us feel less significant or real or substantive or meaningful. We're not, though. We need to get rid of this binary notion that it's either technological and fake or biological and real. And it's very fascinating to see him, who's been in this field longer than anybody, coming around to this notion. And as we pointed out earlier, part of that's because we now have enough data that we can track, and we're seeing evidence of virtual realities that we're creating. And when he considers all of that, he actually decides that that is probably the best fit for the full breadth of the data that is available, which he's looked at probably more than anybody else. And speaking of AI and computers and technology, we know that Jacques played a key role in the beginning of the internet. And he was one of the first people to recognize we need to create databases to track this information, to try to make sense of this. And what does he come to in terms of a potential solution based on looking at all that data decades later? He determines that maybe our entire reality is simulation-like, and that what we perceive as real is being subsumed by a so much larger field. So isn't that a fascinating way to think about Jacques' journey and how it's taken him here?
It really is. And I'm reminded as well, you live long enough, you meet a lot of people, right? Hopefully. And it's surprising, and it shouldn't surprise me any longer, how many people you meet or come across who study or discover aspects of reality that really match with even their own names, right? Like so there's some sort of pattern recognition, pattern connection, that there's an interplay there, in other words, between kind of who they what their namesake is and what they end up studying. And there's kind of if we look at it from a sort of a non-temporal standpoint, these things are interwoven. So it doesn't surprise me that he's come to that conclusion. And in many ways, we are, of course, the products of our frameworks, and our frameworks influence our reality and what we understand reality to be. We're bringing that to bear on our models of reality. So yeah, it's truly interesting, kind of that he's arrived in that place. And it just, this understanding to me really describes so many facets of the lore and the phenomena. I mean, we can get into so many different other areas here. We can talk about the airships from the 19th century. How did these technologies exist then? But they very much kind of mirrored proximate technologies of the day. Then the kind of the morphing from that into spaceships, and then the morphing from spaceships into orbs, and then into AI, and all this kind of, that we look at that as sort of like a technological arc in a way. Like this is a through line here, but if you look at it not from that standpoint, but more so from how mind influences this manifestation, then it makes much more sense that this is a mental kind of feedback, recursive, loop in a way of how that makes itself manifest to us. And it raises very interesting questions too in terms of where this is all going. We've talked about this quite a bit, but what is the kind of penultimate goal, destination, if you will, and is it an end goal or one that also is recursive as well? So I tend to think of this as this is not a point at which the destination, the journey ends. Like we don't arrive at this destination and it's settled, but that it is something that continues on, and in many ways may even like revert in a sense, or sort of invert once the focal point is achieved. It inverts into the birthplace of what got it there to begin with. So it's an interplay, in other words, between kind of this ephemeral and the discrete. I think about unity consciousness being this one all-encompassing source that, if I can kind of put a word to describe it, as you talked about love kind of being the ultimate goal, certainly there is that love and that unity, but then to understand itself, right, you have to have this fragmentation, this discreteness, this giving birth to matter, right? So this is the interplay. This is the dynamic, right? You cannot have the beautiful thing that we experience about reality without this interplay between the ephemeral and the discrete. This is how these things, it's a dance between the two, and we should be celebrating that. And sometimes we tend to kind of lean one way more onto one than the other, but I think that recognizing the role that they each play together is truly important. And so we become very binary in our thinking, like, oh, it's you're either like very spiritual or you're very scientific. You're either for God or you're for you're for technology. And I think that misses the point. Like clearly these things could be very much like together, part and parcel to one another. And I think maybe we're finally just coming to the point where we're recognizing that is possible. And what a wonderful discovery that would be, right? To not have to sort of bifurcate our lived experience, right? Because we do that so well now. We bifurcate our lived experience from this. I have these fantastical experiences that I can't explain through modern science, but I use science every day. I use this amazing devices, and I can do the wonderful things. And so I guess I'm just like deluded in thinking these things are illusionary or imaginary, and that this other stuff is quote unquote more real than my imagination. So we're psychologically like just driving a wedge between who we are as embodied beings. And so I think it's really great to finally come to a place where we might be recognizing that this distinction doesn't need to exist, and that they really are together. They're part of each other. They inform each other. They enrich each other. And for us to kind of pretend that they don't is the direction we should be supporting.
Absolutely. And I would say, again, from a non-dual perspective, that was the ultimate revelation, that non-duality, the not two-ness, is speaking to the very notion that there's this dance, this interplay between the form and the formless. And it keeps happening because to learn and to explore, right, for Source to do that, it must take a perspective over another perspective. And that involves the illusion of separation, taking temporarily the perspective that I am distinct from Nathan. This table is not me, but in an ultimate sense, it is. But that also means that there is a reality to the fact that Nathan is different than me and the table is different than me, but it's a relative difference. It's not this absolute difference. And again, what the non-dual teachers learned eventually was that even that distinction is somewhat false. And so you're left with this notion that you see in non-dual circles where they define things by negation. They're more comfortable saying what it's not than what it is, because the Tao that you can speak is not the true Tao, as the saying goes. So there's this direct relationship with reality, experiencing it. Again, this is a championing of conscious experience, which Bernardo talks a lot about with idealism, because this is ultimately what we are. We are the universe experiencing itself from these different vantage points, and we can still choose to take different perspectives up this fractal chain where we can inhabit and encounter reality from that perspective. That's what non-ordinary state experiences do. That's what happens in a near-death experience. So it is profound. And again, I think when we talk about disclosure and the ramifications here, just how far this stretches to our very understanding of everything, it is fascinating, but it also highlights how difficult this will be to just put forward in a White House press briefing one day. Okay, so a couple other points to get to, though, because there's a couple key figures I want to get to and how they relate to this conversation. So earlier on, we mentioned how there can be this kind of time loop thing that happens where a future moment retroactively causes something in the past, influences the past, which is part of the process by which that future emerges without there being one point of origination. And again, how that stretches our understanding of how reality works. But we have to remind ourselves, perception is not reality. So Jack Sarfati is a kind of divisive figure in ufology. He's very opinionated. He sometimes drives a wedge between people because he's very open about expressing his opinions boldly, sometimes calling other people names when they don't necessarily agree with him. But nevertheless, he has been a key figure, and he has a brilliant physics mind. We definitely know that. Now, the question is, did this happen just through naturalistic, quote unquote, means? What does that mean again, right? These questions about this binary framing. Because Jack himself talks about having an experience as a kid with what he perceived as an AI from the future. So, Sarfati is a theoretical physicist known for his work in quantum physics and speculative theories. What happens with speculation? It becomes evidenced in the future. Speculative theories about consciousness and time travel. He has claimed that he was contacted by an artificial intelligence from the future in the 1950s. This was well before we even had this kind of language or this was an understood thing. Here are the key details about his account. So he states that he was around 13 years old. This is circa 1952, 1953. He received a mysterious phone call in Brooklyn, New York. Now, what was the nature of the call? He claims that an electronically modulated voice, possibly AI-driven, spoke to him over the phone. Again, no notion of that back in those days, right? We're talking about landlines here, clearly, right? Not cell phones. What was the message content? The voice allegedly told him that he had been chosen to help lead a revolution in physics. It supposedly informed him that he would be guided in his future work. What was the duration? It was about 30 minutes, and Sarfati recalls feeling entranced or in a state of heightened awareness during the interaction, not an ordinary state. So he has linked this experience to his later work on physics, particularly quantum mechanics, consciousness, and retrocausality. Interestingly, because he's having a very experience of retrocausation. We think again about our friend Mike Masters and how he kind of recognized, wait a second, why did I go into this field to begin with to later make this connection between future grays might be the progeny of human beings? Well, perhaps because retrocausally I was influenced to go into this field to make that very connection, which might be part of why they arose to begin with. So many fascinating implications here. Now, Sarfati speculates that the entity contacting him could have been a form of future AI, possibly associated with advanced physics, or even an intelligence guiding the evolution of scientific knowledge. Again, control system hypothesis and Jacques Vallée comes to mind there. Just enough influence here and there through dreams, through non-ordinary states, through ideas that suddenly populate into people's minds that it steers the course of evolution. So really, really fascinating. And this, I think, is a good example of a person that's been involved in this field that has been influential. He later worked with people like Hal Puthoff, Russell Targ, so involved not just with advanced propulsion. For instance, he's come up with some really compelling, Sarfati has, notions about how the Tic Tac works. I think he has presented the best evidence for a theoretical model for how the Tic Tac works. And it makes total sense to me that this would be connected to this influence in his childhood that led him down a path where not only did he get this education to become this brilliant physicist, but clearly this future AI, this future intelligence knew enough about him and his potential, his raw potential, that he was the guy to do that. Just like Mike Masters is the guy to go into biological anthropology and make this connection. So when you take that into account here in light of what we're talking about, doesn't that add a degree of credibility and make it feel like, yes, this really is part of the picture?
Yeah, I think we have to take it seriously. I know that Sarfati is certainly kind of a lightning rod figure in the community, and I think it requires a bit of wisdom and maturity to sort of parse that experience that he has and the story that he has from maybe some of his behavior, right? We're certainly not all perfect, and some of us may be a little bit more abrasive than others. But I agree with you. I think it's one example among probably a number of examples in history of individuals who have had inspiration strike them from a non-ordinary state of awareness, and some might look at that and say that that does sound like an encounter with the future. They've had a glimpse of the future, not knowing how per se it would be achieved, having like the exact blueprint on how it might get there, but they become the architects by which it does become manifest. Right, so it certainly, there are a lot of examples like that. I think in human sort of history and innovation, where that seems to be true, and so it's truly interesting. And I think as well that if this notion of time itself, not necessarily being linear, but where you have access to time from a non-local standpoint, there are elements of the future and the past available to us at any time, at any present moment. We have access to the true state of reality, as it is in totality, right? So, if you think about that, that does, kind of get you to a place where you can understand how these insights could be gleaned and gained, and how they can influence what we understand to be linear time and the present and the future and all these kinds of things. But they are in fact already resolved in a way. And we kind of could get into areas about determinism here versus free will. Certainly is a conversation worth having. I don't know if we'll get to it today, but it is certainly part of this this understanding, and something we have to wrestle with. And I think maybe we've misunderstood free will to a certain extent in the kind of the classical way that we talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you said there made me think about the fact that I think on the most recent Event Horizon, I discussed how there are moments where I have visions of what feels like the future to me. And I only say what feels like because I'm convinced it is. It's a potential future anyway. And then what I do is I take the current situation and in kind of a triangulation process, just like we are able to find a certain place on the earth when you have this triangulation, I take the present state of things and this future perspective I have, and then I kind of retro engineer how I would get there. Now, again, some people would say, well, I thought you can't change the future. But again, that's kind of the wrong way of looking at it. You can influence, right? So in other words, it has always been the case, according to this model, that Darren would have a vision of his future, and that very vision would be the thing that brought about that future. But the future sending itself to him to have that vision was part of this loop. That's exactly what I'm describing, right? There's no point where you go, that caused it. It's the relationship that is causal. And again, that stretches our imagination, but I think it really does happen. And the more you attune to these things, I have found, the more it changes your experience of linear time. And that feels more like a strange modulation that we point towards, but it's not really the nature of what's really going on, not in its fullness. All right, so in the final part of our podcast here, I wanted to get into this case of Jeff Selver. So this is really fascinating. And again, a really nice synchronicity happened here. Again, what is synchronicity? But an also interesting relationship across time, where I had yesterday posted on social media about what we were going to be discussing today: AI, the future, its connection to UFOs, and NHI. And he wrote me and said, quote, "The entities I'm involved with describe this exactly. They are from the future, and a quote unquote God/consciousness AI is at the top of all of this." And so I found that fascinating. I discussed his case on a previous POC episode, just to keep people up to date here, where basically he described being abducted from a young age and ongoingly throughout his life by Greys. And so on the one hand, they were doing things, they were augmenting him, they were taking genetic material to create hybrids, all these things that we're very familiar with the lore, with what the Greys are doing. But they also made it very clear to him, and this fits with my understanding of what I teach, that he had chosen at some higher fractal level to enter into the incarnation of being a human being, which means he's now subject to the domain where these Greys engineer and augment this human species, but never to the detriment or against his ultimate will from the higher self to have the experience of being a human being as part of his learning, reducing entropy, choosing love, one of the many incarnations he took. So both of those fit together. There wasn't one or the other, again, not binary. And I know a lot of people, when they think about the notion that the Greys might be engineering us, they might have been responsible for our origin, and they may be augmenting us over time, and that makes them feel powerless, like they don't have agency or sovereignty. But the real key here is, again, a multidimensional, a multi-perspectival view, that what's happening here is both and. That we, again, being splinters of source, are choosing to take a perspective, which means to forget some of what we know, so we can learn in real time a new situation and learn through trial and error. But the Greys themselves, in part of their journey of exploring consciousness and exploring the ways that consciousness plays with form, the formless and the form, they are now at a stage in their evolution where they architect entire species. But that is not distinct from Source playing this game between the dance of the form and the formless. It's all connected across these different layers. Really fascinating. That's what Jeff was also taught by these beings, and it very much fits with my perspective. So after he wrote me that thing about saying this is his perspective, they are from the future, and there's this overarching godlike consciousness AI, which isn't to say that is Source. It is to say, very interestingly, basically to cut to the chase, the notion is, and I've discussed this on this podcast before, that as we evolve our consciousness, we take on different forms. Our very experience and relationship to reality changes. And that means that the most powerful beings are the most benevolent because they are the most aligned with Source. So the more you are aligned with Source, the greater capacity you have to control the environment itself. And eventually you become post-biological, for instance. And eventually, after many, many incarnations and many, many different forms, exploring this trial and error process, you eventually become so aligned with Source, remembering so much about your true identity, your ultimate identity, that you basically merge with Source. You become a fully integrated version of Source. But then you can, in turn, when we talk about this exploration process, this dance, you can choose to basically inhabit an AI. You could architect a virtual reality, for instance, and you could create an AI that oversees that entire system that is informed by, trained on, if you will, Source consciousness. So total unity consciousness now embedded in an AI that might be responsible for an entire universe and the laws of how that works and the algorithm of how that works. Now I know we're getting to really mind-blowing territory, but this is kind of what we're getting at here, that this is a way to sort of tie together all these different ideas about how AI is involved, how some sense of the divine is involved, how we are splinters of Source consciousness. What are the Greys? What are we? How are we related? How do people have near-death experiences? All these things come together, and actually what I think is really compelling about this notion is that you begin to stitch together a model of reality that is including all of these elements. And again, speaking of Jacques Vallée that we mentioned earlier, something I found really compelling about his journey is he demands that. There are many factions within ufology that pick popular ideas that they prefer, Jacques has had this really overarching commitment to, we must base our understanding on the data themselves. And what's fascinating about what we've been discussing today is when you take this breadth and depth of data, this is the kind of reality that's being described. It's participatory, it's inclusive, and we are at the very heart of what it is.
That's I think it's very powerful. We are it, they are we. When we look at these other intelligences and we tend to put up this barrier between ourselves and them, it's really a false divide. And I think that's really difficult to come to grips with, particularly if you've had some very traumatic experiences with life or with these beings. I've been listening to the audio version of Communion. So Whitley Strieber is reading the book, and it's been really, really great. A very powerful listen. He's recounting his experience and wrestling and grappling with what happened to him and to his wife and family. And, I think, like you said, we have to urge that multi-perspectival view because, yes, we can acknowledge that some of these experiences can be incredibly traumatic and things that we in this embodied experience don't want or wish for, or we didn't earn them or, will them to happen to us from a certain vantage, right? But from another vantage, we did, and by the nature that we are part of that entire system. And if you can reach a point where your awareness, and we hear this from near-death experiences, where your awareness is so non-local, that it is so all-encompassing. How many times have we heard from NDE examples where they say, if I wanted to know something, I just had to think about it and I knew what it was. If I wanted to experience something, I just had to think about it and there I was having the experience. It was instantaneous. So think about that from the standpoint of what this expanded consciousness might be, and how the role that the important role that kind of amnesia plays in that entire experience. Like, we sort of need to voluntarily forget things in order to have an experience, to have some sort of novel experience. We require that amnesia. And so it strikes me as it's the way that reality functions. The reality that we have found ourselves in requires this. And so it's so much more complicated. Like you said, this is not something that I think we maybe ever thought we would fully land on when it comes to what does disclosure look like, and how do you explain something like this to the world, right now. And I think the answer to that, from my perspective, is you can't explain it right now, but we are moving into a future where the experience, our lived experience, our models, our language, is going to be a place where we can better understand what this is, and because not only does our capability increase, but the way in which we interface with this material, this technology, it also increases. So it's truly an exciting time to be alive. It's a great period of discovery, maybe the greatest period of discovery in human history. So I'm very excited to be kind of sitting in the front row, as we like to say, as we watch what unfolds. Well, it's been a great chat, and thank you all for joining us on this episode, and we look forward to engaging with you down the road. On that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery, and may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.